thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate you all being with us. So today we're going to be presenting on how COVID-19 accelerated the transformation of the global financial systems. So really, we're going to be talking about how this pandemic has accelerated the transformation of a lot of businesses and processes. And ultimately, we really want to show how blockchain technology is involved in this transformation. And we really want to thank everyone for donating. We really appreciate it. We've donated ourselves as well, and all the proceeds of this initiative is going to go to three different charities that are all going to be supporting COVID relief efforts. So it's going to be Food Share Toronto, Hamilton Health Sciences, and the Bermuda Community Foundation. So we're really excited that we could all come together and support our communities and really help move things forward and also bring in some technology education. So without further ado, I want to introduce Casey, who's the VP of Development at Hamilton Health Sciences, who will just be telling you a little bit about what these donations are going towards the Hamilton Health Sciences.
Thank you so much, Karam, and welcome everybody. It's nice to have an international audience, folks from across Canada and Bermuda as well, and welcome. As Karam mentioned, I'm VP of Development at Hamilton Health Sciences Foundation, and we really appreciate the gesture that the groups from Penrose and Informal have chosen to support some terrific organizations that are doing important work in this time of a pandemic, and we really appreciate the support. Hamilton Health Sciences is a group of several hospitals in the Hamilton area, but we serve millions of people across the province of Ontario. We are the regional center of excellence for trauma, for cancer care, and for pediatrics at McMaster Children's Hospital. We're also closely linked with McMaster University and do a great deal of health research. And right now we've directed significant resources in our health research to treatments and vaccines for COVID. In the meantime, on the front line, our healthcare workers are treating patients with COVID and at the same time trying to manage to continue to provide that important life-saving care and all of the other areas of healthcare. It's been a real challenge, and we couldn't do it without the kind of community outreach that this webinar today is an example of. People are doing what they can to support us and support our healthcare providers who are on the front line trying to stay safe and trying to provide treatment to a disease that's very difficult to treat while, as I said, continuing to provide all of the other care that we are relied on for. So the proceeds today are going to help us. Our foundation is supporting at our hospitals everything from protective equipment for the healthcare workers to advanced equipment in intensive care units, beds, cardiac monitors, vital signs monitors. We're even supplying hundreds of iPads so that families can communicate. It's really tough when a family can't come and visit someone who's sick in the hospital because infection control has taken away that opportunity to be with your family when they're in the hospital. So we're at least able to provide iPads so families can communicate during a difficult time. And all of that is coming through support from community donations and things like this event today. So thank you to the Penrose Group and Informal Systems and everyone who's joined here today because our hospitals really need that support. And of course, the Bermuda Community Foundation and Food Share are also doing a great deal of tremendous work to help people through this time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Casey. So without further ado, we're going to actually get into the presentation. A little quick introductions. My name is Karam. I'm one of the founding partners of Penrose Partners. I've been working in the blockchain space since 2015-16. And I have done a lot of different things in the space, but ultimately what we do is we help startups in the blockchain space grow, and we help enterprises, governments, and larger traditional institutions understand the value of blockchain technology and help them ultimately adopt it. I also have the pleasure of guest lecturing at McMaster at the MBA program on blockchain technology, and I've also been involved in deploying some of the first university courses on blockchain technology in the world in India. Sean?
Very nice. Thank you, Karam. And yeah, my name is Sean Stapley. I'm also a partner at Penrose with Karam. So we focus on many similar aspects of our jobs, but I've also been diving a lot more into the space since about 2015, 2014. I got involved and when I moved to Canada in 2012, I bought my first winter coat with Bitcoin. So I've been involved in the space for quite a few years. And yeah, my work tends to dive a little bit more heavily into kind of the research side of things. Bit of a background in venture capital and startups. So it's really good to work with these innovators in the space and really see what we can build next. Ethan?
Hey folks, I'm Ethan Buckman. I've been working in the cryptocurrency space since 2013 or so. I'm a co-founder of the Cosmos and Tendermint projects, which have been pushing the boundaries on proof of stake and have put a number of blockchains into production over the last couple of years, with collectively now over $1 billion of value running through them. And more recently, I'm the CEO of Informal Systems, which is a new company that we just set up this year to focus on formal verification of distributed systems. So ensuring that distributed system software, like blockchain technology software, is very high quality and to be able to prove that it satisfies certain guarantees. So thank you all for coming. So I'll take you briefly through the agenda. We're going to start off, Karam's going to start off talking a little bit about the current financial system and some of the issues that COVID has, that have already existed, but COVID has made even more apparent. Then Sean will take over and talk a little bit about some innovations that are happening in the financial system, specifically around stablecoins and central bank digital currencies. And then I'll move into talking a little bit more about the diversity of currencies and cryptocurrencies and blockchain solutions, and more specifically, the proof of stake technology and where that's going. And then at the end, we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. So if you have questions, you're welcome to type them throughout, either in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll sort of triage them as we go.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Ethan. So you can knock your camera off if you like. So let's get started. So what's going on? And really don't need to dive too deep into this because you guys are all following the news and you're seeing what's happening. But to begin, it was really a health crisis, and the safety of ourselves, our families, and friends were really what was at risk first. And after a lot of the concerns around this were starting to get controlled, some more repercussions started to come about. And this really came in the form of a financial crisis. So as we can see, not only are we suffering, if not a worse financial crisis than 2008, but it seems to be only getting worse. And not only is it affecting the markets, but a lot of people in Canada, US, Bermuda, around the world are losing their jobs. And so the implications of this system that has been established many years ago is really slowly starting to prove fragile. But some other things are going on too. Throughout this, as we've all realized and seen, is that the price of oil is dropping. The demand has dropped significantly, and if you look at the futures market, it's gone even negative, where people are being paid to take barrels of oil. But on top of this, the world is moving more digital, and e-commerce really is shining. Throughout all this, Shopify became Canada's second most valuable company. And if we want to look at a little bit of a silver lining in all this, air quality around the whole world has improved. The bottom right, you can see pictures in India from 2018 to April of this year, and just see the improvements in the air quality. So what are a few overall trends that we're seeing in this? Well, if you look at the chart on the left, we can see that online grocers, gaming, food delivery, general e-commerce and merchandising, and of course, alcohol has ticked up. But what's really interesting to see here is when you look at the far left and you see the things like airlines, cruises, travel, apparel, and fast food even, we start seeing, what are our needs? What are our needs and what are wants and things that we might take for granted or, have too much of already. And we can really see this summarized here on the right from a Forbes article on the main trends. So people are moving to mobile commerce and demanding there be alternative ways of payments. People don't want to necessarily be using cash, and you can't necessarily give someone a $5 bill digitally. Businesses and consumers, everyone has had to stay home. So making software even that much more important to conduct business, to communicate with others, it's really become an integral piece in the way that we work. And with software comes opportunities for automation. Processes that required you to walk over to somebody's desk and tell them something or pass a message can now potentially be automated through the systems that we're using. And ultimately, for everybody, everyone's demanding for faster delivery, whether it's faster delivery of information, faster delivery of your dinner or your groceries, or if it's products coming through a supply chain. And really, in a time of urgency, in a time of pandemic, this demand for faster delivery can really cause some other problems. So something that we've experienced, and really tying back to the pandemic and to the technology, is the strains that we're seeing on global supply chains. It's a pandemic, and decisions need to be made quickly, and certain needs need to come through. And so when people are making decisions in times of pandemic, they might not be following the proper due diligence processes that they normally would. They need medical devices, they need masks, and they need it now. Whether it be a hospital, government, or a business trying to protect their employees, the demand for masks has been absolutely through the roof. And from us working on actually trying to source masks from China to our partners in North America, we have found hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud. Fake products don't have the right certifications and FDA approvals. And so we'd love to give a shout out to our friends at Real Items that have been working on this and actually going and validating the documentation of FDA approvals, pre-verifying suppliers in China, and bringing trust into a global supply chain where medical professionals and governments can know for sure that the products they receive are actually the ones that they ordered, and all the proper FDA documentation is attached to it digitally with the data. And so this image on the left really does sum it up. Businesses were thinking digital transformation is years away, and they don't have to change anytime soon, but COVID really showed that this had to change. So let's tie it back into the financial side of things. Where do the current problems in our system lie? Well, we can break it down to 4 key areas: problems and limitations of physical fiat money, economically devaluing and inflation of money, broken incentives that have led to economic and wealth imbalances, and then lack of overall sustainability of this system, whether it be social, economic, or environmental. So let's start with the problems and limitations of cash. Really, where I started feeling this was when I went to my local grocery store during the pandemic to buy my grocery needs, and cash was no longer being accepted. I had to either pay with credit card or use my phone, but they were not accepting bills or coins due to the risk. And so we did a little bit deeper into money, and we saw that this is a report from the Federal Reserve for the 2020 currency budget, where it actually costs $830 million USD about every year to just print paper money and mint coins. And when you start thinking about it a little bit deeper, it actually, in the US Mint website, the cost for every penny is actually 2 cents in copper and zinc. So, you know, the value of the metal being worth more than the value of the money itself really starts to beg question, is it really holding its value, and can it in the future? And the final interesting piece is something that really stuck with me, and I've communicated to a lot of people, is that in Wuhan, the People's Bank of China was actually just burning piles of cash when the pandemic broke out. And this was really interesting to me because people clearly value their health and their safety over this physical money. And if it can be destroyed so easily or devalued across the value of our health and lives, really begs the question is, why is it still circulating? Which brings us to a really interesting graph, and I'll give credit to Sean for finding this one. But essentially what you guys are looking at here is the S&P 500 from 1997 to 2020. And the one on the left is priced in USD, and the one on the right is priced in gold. So if we look at the graph on the left, we can see leading up to the 2000 tech bubble, it was building up nicely and the economy was growing strong. When the bubble burst, we started seeing some new lows. As we started kind of building up to 2008, the economy was gaining strength, and then ultimately the Great Recession of 2008 hit that we all saw, and the economy suffered. But then since then, something interesting really has happened, that it seems that the economy has just been getting stronger and stronger and stronger until today, or until very recently, where we felt another drop. But really, is the economy this much stronger than it was in 2000? Well, the graph on the right tells a very different story. So as we can see, the S&P 500 priced in gold here, call it the gold standard, was really doing something similar leading up to 2000. But then after the bubble burst in 2000, we took a drop. And rather than building back up, it seems that after 2008's recession, we took a new low for the US economy. And then from there, it just seems that, we were building back up, but we were not even close or half to the point that we were at in 2000. So this really starts to question, where is value truly created? And is this quantitative easing really creating value, or is it leading to some misconceptions along the way? And so really this begs the question of, are the incentives all aligned for value to be grown through the system? And really, when we start considering what's been happening after these recessions, it really does come to large corporations getting bailed out, and really starts playing into the story of profits over people. And really, you can see it on the left, but need money to make loans to people who need money. Really, what I think a lot of us have started to learn is that all the intermediaries that are, running on profits and know the support that the government or the central banks are ready to bail them out, worst case scenario, allows them to game the system, wedge themselves into society and in business, and make themselves grow more valuable and more profitable. But I think today and during this time, we've really understood what is essential. And I think the one really big thing we need to understand is the healthcare sector. They're the teams that are out there on the front lines working and proving to us that they are the ones that are protecting us. They're keeping us and our families safe. So why is the system not built to support them? And a lot of warning signs were leading up to this, where billions of dollars were being cut in Ontario for the healthcare sector. And even the article on the bottom there on January 23rd was a cry for help for the industry, the healthcare sector, saying that there was not enough funding to be able to support any sort of, anything normally, but even a pandemic at worst case would not be supported. Which brings us to a question, is this system sustainable? Well, it might not be, because the way we see it in all this profit-driven growth really does not contribute to the sustainable balance of our world, whether it be economic, whether it be social, or whether it be environmental. And these are some things that we're going to explore later on in the presentation. But which brings us back to money. So really, why don't we have a new or an internet money? Why hasn't someone gone ahead and created this already? Well, it's something very interesting, but it really goes back to the emergence of the internet. And when the internet emerged, we had a new method of information sharing. No longer was music and videos and DVDs being sold at Blockbuster and physical stores, but we could share them online. And this really created a disruptive business model. And ultimately, what it arose was the double spend problem. And the double spend problem came from the concept of a music file, an email, or a video being copied, paste, and sent to 10 or 10,000 people, really devaluing the worth of that content. And so the regulators had to step in and stop this. And when you think about that concept in money, if I had one digital dollar and I could copy, paste, and send it to 10 of my friends, does that dollar still hold its value? And the argument would be no. And so there were many attempts over time to solve this double spend problem, like projects like eCash and DigiGold really tried to solve this double spend problem, but ultimately you had to trust that organization, and the government shut them down because it was combating the US dollar. And so those networks got shut down and really didn't have a solution to internet money until 2008. In 2008, we saw the emergence of the Bitcoin white paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto. A very interesting tidbit, Satoshi is still to this day not known. We don't know if it's a he, she, they, a group of people. All we know is that this white paper emerged, and in 2009, the Bitcoin blockchain was live. So what did this blockchain really do? Well, it solved the double spend problem using mathematics and cryptography, and it created a peer-to-peer trustless network of value transfer. So now you could confidently be able to transfer value to someone, and the recipient could know that you're not also sending it to someone else. The other beauty of this was it was a completely decentralized network, meaning that there was no way to shut it down. Even if you tried, if the government, central banks all tried, the Bitcoin network has been running for over 10 years now with no one coming close to shutting it down. And a last bit of tidbit here is that in the Genesis block of Bitcoin, which is the first block that was mined on the Bitcoin blockchain, there was a very interesting message that read, The Times, 03 January 2009, Chancellor of brink of second bailout for banks, which refers to the front page of the Times on that date, which is a very interesting piece because the emergence of Bitcoin came after the 2008 recession, and we can leave it to you to depict what Satoshi meant by this message. Oh, there we go. So from Bitcoin, really things exploded. And this is going to be the most complicated slide you're going to see today, and I'm not going to go too much into anything, but really what I want you guys to understand is that from the emergence of blockchain and Bitcoin really spawned a whole world of opportunities and a bunch of different currencies, from different utilities being used for coins for utilities to normal securities being tokenized, whether they be real estate assets, contracts, futures, or even luxury items are all being tokenized using blockchain technology today. And some of the more interesting ones that are seeing a lot of adoption are stable currencies, stable coins, and these commodity tokens that have an underlying asset that is actually fixing the price. So this is kind of a high level picture of what's the explosion of cryptocurrencies have been, and Ethan's going to talk more about this later. Ultimately, this is what the cryptocurrency market looks like. In 2018, there was a surge of capital that came into the market that hit us at $830 billion USD. But since then, it's really trickled out and the volatility has not calmed down. We are sitting closer to just under 300 billion in market cap today, but that volatility of that market has really scared investors and participants away. But if you actually look across the bottom at the 24-hour volumes, you can see that since 2008, adoption has been increasing with more volumes every day, more wallets and more users starting to get to know and play around with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Which brings us to the point of stablecoins. So why do people not want to use Bitcoin for currency? Because it's volatile. So really, you got to think about what is a good equivalent of digital money that can hold its value. Well, here there's three different examples of stablecoins. And the understanding of the stablecoins is that it uses blockchain technology to solve the double spend problem. To some extent, it's decentralized, and it acts and holds its value like traditional money does. So the first one I want to talk about is physical asset-backed stablecoins. And these are things that could have either real estate or physical products, and in this example, gold. So we know that gold, the gold standard, relatively holds its price quite steady. And so this first example of the PMGT is actually from the West Australian Bank's Perth Mint. So for every ounce of gold, they have a certificate of authenticity attached to it, and that creates one PMGT. So that one PMGT is actually backed by 1 ounce of physical gold that sits in the reserves of that mint, making it so that it's just a digital equivalent of gold. We can't interact or pass gold around very easily today because we don't use gold coins, but this would form a way of digitally transferring the value of your gold. Second topic is the currency-backed or currency-pegged initiatives. So these just mimic what might be a US dollar, a Canadian dollar, and is ultimately leveraging blockchain technology and a digital aspect to behave the same, and it's fixed to the price of the currencies that we know today. So in Canada, we actually have QCAD. That's a very interesting one. There's a few others as well. And the third one is these cryptographic, crypto-backed and decentralized stablecoins that Ethan will be talking a little bit more in a later presentation. The one thing we really want to touch on in this presentation is Libra and what Libra really is. So last year, Libra announced what they were actually doing. It's changed now, but initially what Libra had announced was they were going to build a stable currency for the world, a stable currency that allowed inclusion, that allowed accessibility, and allowed you to use the Libra currency in any of these 28 different places. So these were the 28 associations that came together and said, we are going to govern this Libra ecosystem. The currency is going to be a basket of 5 different currencies around the world. I believe it was the dollar, the yen, the euro, and it was all basketed into this reserve that was held at multiple banks around the world. And that basket of currencies was to hold the stability of the price, and all these different businesses were going to benefit or be able to use it. ultimately, the US Congress said, no chance, Zuckerberg, we are not letting you take control of the global financial system, something like this. It was very apparent that Facebook had not only betrayed the trust of its consumers and its users, but really proved that they were not responsible in managing and protecting data. And so if you start considering Facebook having access to all of our social data and not being responsible with that, if we were to give them some sort of control or access into financial data, the problems of creating that overlap of financial data and social data starts really becoming a concern. Not to mention that the Libra was combating other central bank digital currency projects or even currencies as we know it. And Sean is going to continue here about a little bit more depth about what Libra 2.0 looks like and how the new central bank digital currency projects are emerging. Over to you, Sean.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Graham. Yeah, so listen, as Karim said, Libra 1.0 was very much intended to be this basket of currencies in order to enable some sort of platform for global commerce. But as we've all probably seen over the past few years, Zuckerberg has not been the best with data privacy, with considerations for people's individual rights. And as a result, US Congress actually pulled him in front and said, what's going on? You're taking away the ability of the government to control fiat. We need to know more, or we'll simply put a stop to it. And so what they've done over time is they've rehashed the project, now keeping it separate so that you have your, let's say, a Libra dollar, a Libra euro, and other currencies such as this. So it does mean that it keeps the currency still separate and allows for each one to be still in some way, shape, or form tweaked if the government itself sees fit. Now, of course, the overall idea of this project very much was to bring together the companies from payments, from certain exchanges, incubators, from commerce, and even things like music, which we saw in there with Spotify. The idea being, if you have this interconnected ecosystem, you're able to more easily facilitate trade and allow for people to participate in what they want to purchase. Now, this obviously ran into lots of issues bit by bit, but what they've come together in the end to say is that we're not quite sure what the future of money looks like, but what Libra wants to be now is more along the payment rails. They want to build the underlying infrastructure. So this means that as we look at this over time, Libra is setting up the structure such that other governments can come in and say, we want to be part of this digital drive, but let us use your system. We'll happily piggyback on top of this. So now that Libra is playing a little bit more by the rules of the governments around the world, they're more likely to be able to build this out. Their global reach is incredible, being regularly used across the world, and the fact that they're available on simple mobile flip phones does give them a huge advantage. And the fact that overall their pitch is essentially saying, we have financial benefits for everyone involved. All you have to do is give us the green light. So with that in mind, and we do want to understand, why is it that the central bank even exists in these countries? Well, at the heart of it, there's two reasons. One, keeping basic financial stability so that the rest of us can actually get along with our lives, simply for going to the store, for going about our daily lives, and for being able to save up and invest in our futures. And the second reason is to be able for the governments to enact monetary policy, such that, as you may have seen recently, there have been huge injections of money in the States into relief support, in the lines of trillions and trillions of dollars being pumped in. Now, this would not be possible if the currency, was more decentralized. But the other fact to remember here is that governments don't want to suddenly go into a world where they don't control the economy. Previously, we've seen situations where when governments have run into situations where the economy is careening off the rails, such as with things like hyperinflation in Zimbabwe or such, it becomes impossible for the country to function. So that's the reason that there's meant to be this central bank. And so any central bank digital currency has to be designed in a way that supports these two objectives. And it needs to enable the government to move forward, not to give up control over their economy. So with that in mind, how do we look at this in terms of the fractional reserve system? We want to look at this in the terms of, next slide, please, us diving into saying, how does our current system work? Well, at a very high level, if I'm a business that puts $100,000 into a bank, that bank doesn't necessarily need to hold all of the money. They'll pay me a percentage of interest on the money that I loan, but they will also loan this money out in turn to other businesses. These other businesses could then go and store their money with a separate bank. But keeping in mind that the bank only ever has to hold a certain percentage. In the example here, 5%. So it means that my $100,000 is gone into the bank. and 95,000 has been lent out again. Now, all this then trickles on that customer then stores the money and is then lent out with a 5% reserve. So 90,250 goes out. So overall, this system makes sense when you want to stimulate the economy and to be able to more easily facilitate people's purchases. But it does mean that in situations like 2008, we did run into situations where when the economy starts to crumble and when we begin to see the cracks in the system, it does result in some serious consequences for those that are involved. Now, the fractional reserve amount means that at the end of the day, the amount that you and I see on our banking apps and when we go to our bank branches doesn't necessarily represent the dollars that are held in the central bank. The central bank itself might only hold, an example, $1 billion, but because of this fractional reserve, there may be upwards of $10 to $20 billion in the economy. Now, that's fine to have as a general system, but when we're talking about a central bank digital currency, we only mean that there is a one-for-one digital trade for the dollars that a central bank holds. A CBDC, or a central bank digital currency, is simply a digital representation of physical cash. Next slide, please. And so, there we go, perfect, cheers. And so at a high level, what is it that we're talking about? Is that all that money has to do realistically is three things. One, it lets us store value from day to day and from year to year. Secondly, it's a medium of exchange, such that I can give this money to you and you'll in turn be able to give me something back. And finally, it's a unit of account, such that I know that my prices are going to be denominated in a certain currency. So if we look at all of these different features together, what does it mean for it to be a central bank digital currency? Well, at the top left of this, you can see that if something's simply widely accessible and digital, we have the bank deposits like today. But additionally, if we have something along the lines of the top one where you see CB reserves and settlements, that's simply the central bank holding the money that's involved in the individual institutions. So it means that every bank has an account with the central bank, but it doesn't mean that every individual can participate in this system. And on the bottom left, you can see down there what is in fact going to be central bank issued and widely accessible but not digital. Well, that's the dollars in your bank account. And finally, you can see on the right side, a token-based structure that is digital is the private digital tokens that we know, like Bitcoin, like Ethereum, and many of these other currencies that have been created over the last few years. But at the heart of it, in the center, is we want to have something that is both widely accessible to the public, is digital to facilitate easy trade, and is issued by the central bank. And that is where the central bank digital currency comes in. The final piece is what's come to light in the last few years with blockchain rising to the front, such that we're able to have a token-based system. And that results in a number of efficiencies. Next slide, please. And so we want to be considering all these in light of what does it mean that if we have a central bank digital currency? Why should I care as to what the reason is for having this upgrade as we can see it? Well, at the heart of it, as Karim mentioned, first and foremost, there's no cost of fiat creation. In the United States alone, there's $1 billion going each and every year simply to creating money. It costs about 2 cents to make a penny and about 7 cents to make a nickel. So year after year, the government of the United States is losing money simply creating the cash that we use each and every year. Additionally, we don't have to worry about counterfeiting anymore. It's not possible for you or I to be able to go away and make a counterfeit digital dollar. Cryptographically, it's secured such that there is no way that you can replicate this system unless you are the central bank. It's designed to do so. Third, the auditability is unprecedented. We're able to suddenly have in a situation where the central bank is able to see the flows of money in an economy and can already proactively prevent any sort of terrorism funding or money laundering that's happening nowadays. Logistically, it just makes sense. We're able to more easily transfer between different parts of the economy completely digitally. No need for banking trucks and no need to transport wads of cash around. It's just a more efficient system. And finally, the last few points I want to touch on is that a central bank digital currency means that it allows the government to continue to enact its monetary policy of today, but at a much higher level of efficiency. When the government has been printing trillions of dollars in the States, that money is going into the economy without an efficient way to see what the benefits happened. We can't see that if a tax cut really benefited the people or if the trickle-down economics actually made sense in this situation. But with this sort of solution, we would be able to see that. And the final point of a central bank digital currency is that it improves the financial inclusion. It allows for us to have a situation in which more civilians can get involved than before in the world economy, and allows for us to have a situation where each and every participant and every citizen can begin to take part in the global economy, rather than now where we have situations where the homeless or those that are simply downtrodden are unable to participate due to the high costs of having a bank account or being a part of this system. Now, this all sounds wonderful, but we do have to keep in mind certain facts and considerations for this. First and foremost, when looking at how on earth a central bank digital currency could actually take place, we do have to look at the economy as a whole. How does your local bank take it? How does your corner store take it? How am I able to pay my rent in this if everyone doesn't accept this? So the integrations do have to be considered as this goes on. Second point being, how a central bank digital currency will look will depend a lot on just how strong the banking institutions are in each country. For example, in the United States, the banking institutions are fairly strong and well integrated into society. So any sort of central bank digital currency would likely go much more through the banking institutions than if we have something like China, which has a much more centralized and autonomous structure. As a result of that, it means that they're less likely to go through individual banking institutions and can do it much more from top down to every citizen. And the other points, as I mentioned, financial inclusion is necessary, but if you don't keep in mind the less fortunate in society, it would be easy for this to simply be a tool used by those that are already well suited in this system. So we do have to keep this in mind. And the final point, which, especially speaking in many of the circles that are focused on privacy, we have to consider the data rights of each citizen. At a high level, if this solution is to be implemented, we have to know that our transactions and our purchase history, shall we say, is allowed to be private, because as each citizens around the world, we do have a right to not have to disclose each and everything that we're doing. Now, with a central bank digital currency, these transactions would be completely apparent to the central bank. And without getting into a discussion around hacking a central bank, we do have to keep in mind that systems can break. And when we're talking about something as big as people's money and people's livelihoods, these are things that have to be considered. And so let's talk a little bit finally about what are the active systems that are around the world and what is actually going on these days. Well, as I mentioned, the USA is considering switching over into digital dollars. This would have rapidly increased their ability to improve their COVID-19 relief support. So instead of people getting checks in the mail and having to physically go and deposit in your bank account, you'd actually be able to receive it immediately and spend it digitally without ever leaving your home. And so in light of the virus and the disease that has spread because of this, we do have to recognize that makes so much more sense if I don't have to leave my home in order to go about my life. Now, they're still in the early discussion stage and we don't really know too much about it, but the States is going to set a precedent for what other countries do for their digital currencies. So we are keeping a close eye. On the other side of the spectrum, China last week actually rolled out the first images of their live central bank digital currency. The digital yuan is already set to go and is actually being run in several provinces now. So they're further ahead than we are, but they're also sticking with much more of a permission structure, such that you're not going to be able to join this network if you're an outsider, if you're a institution trying to enter the Chinese market, or if you're simply a businessman looking to open yourself up in there. It means that the Chinese government is able to have a much tighter hold on the financial policy of the country and of the purchase decisions of its citizens, which, without getting too much into a Black Mirror episode, does have important considerations to keep in mind as this progresses. Now, somewhere in the middle between these two situations, we do have live products in the Caribbean with the ECCB and in Sweden with the e-krona. So both these tests are actually currently up and running. And so far, things are going well. There's a lot more financial inclusion. There's a lot more of the ability for participants to get actively involved and see that their money is more efficiently flowing throughout the economy. And it also has worked out that for those participating businesses, they actually have seen growth in revenue month after month, even in spite of the recession. So it's showing that this financial inclusion makes sense. We just have to be delicate about how we're doing it. And finally, Bermuda is another one that I really want to highlight, both because it's my home, and additionally because I do think that they're approaching it in particularly the right manner. They're keeping an open platform and are preparing to take a look at all the options before diving in. And it's particularly because, as we know, Bermuda does not have its own currency such that it's separate from being pegged to the US dollar. Their situation is such that it leaves you open to be able to explore a sort of solution that allows for more financial inclusion. Bermuda is a great test case in this situation because with 60-something thousand people, we're able to more efficiently be able to look at just how can this set up a way that the government can more easily facilitate the growth of the economy, or in this situation, COVID relief. As some of you may know, and those in Bermuda will know, Bermuda has been setting up a situation that you can receive $2,000 a month for your unemployment benefit. Now, this has gone fairly smoothly by most accounts, but it does mean that Bermuda would be able to issue this potential currency and keep it circulating within the economy. So it means that you could see the impact and the help for individuals much more easily if you can control the impact and the areas in which it can be spent. So overall, I'm hugely positive on the side of seeing where Bermuda goes with this. They're going in the right direction, and honestly, it's an exciting time to be involved, both as a Bermudian and as someone working in the blockchain space. But you can see overall that these initiatives make sense. We have to be looking into what is the future of money, how does it come together, but additionally, how do governments play a role compared to that which might be already being created by private institutions? And to discuss that a little bit further in detail, I'd like to introduce Ethan, who is one of the people actually building the potential money of the future, and just to talk about what exactly the future might look like in terms of us having well, I'll let him explain it in much better than I can, but what will the future of money look like? And with that, Ethan, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Sean. So we've been talking about financial systems, about monetary policy, central bank digital currencies, and so on. And I think central bank digital currencies are a step in the right direction, but I just want to challenge a little bit because we seem to take for granted somewhat that central banks are the only institutions that can issue currency, and that somehow, they're the only ones responsible enough in our societies to manage money for us. And yet, as we've seen, they seem to have completely mismanaged things. And now we're in the wake of a pandemic. We don't know how long it's going to last, and our financial system is woefully unprepared. And still, we're talking about okay, well, the central banks are they're bailing people out, and the government's bailing people out. Where are they going to get the money from? And they're issuing all this relief and so on. And meanwhile, our municipalities and our cities are kind of stuck with no monetary control, no monetary policy control. They're beholden to the provinces or the states and the federal governments. And it just sort of calls into question a little bit: is there a better alternative solution to currency and to the structure of money that could provide a more robust, more sustainable society? And to some extent, everything that's on this slide has functioned as currency in one way or another. And the question there is really, what protocols establish these as currencies, and from where does the consensus that these are currencies actually derive, right? And we've sort of taken for granted that only central banks can issue currencies, but then cryptocurrencies emerged on the scene, seemingly out of nowhere, not issued by central banks or by any particular institution for that matter. And it sort of, leads us to think a little bit deeper: where do currencies come from? How can we make new currencies that are potentially more robust and better represent the values of communities and of societies and so on? And so what I want to do here, just very briefly first, is take you through a little bit of what kind of currencies have existed over the last couple hundred years as alternatives that have been issued by individuals or small counties or what have you, just to sort of lay the foundation for the idea that new currencies it's not a new thing. There's a lot of precedent for it. And in fact, the singular central bank-backed digital currency is actually somewhat more novel and is maybe something we need to move somewhat away from or find a better structure for. So to start with, we have time. So time is really the one true currency. We all have the same number of hours in a day, assuming we're all living on Earth. And some folks have materialized this into systems called time banks, where essentially the currency is denominated in hours. So you put in an hour's worth of time doing any arbitrary thing, and you'll be able to redeem an hour's worth of time from someone else, right? And so systems like this, they've been difficult to get off the ground sometimes because everyone likes to value their time at different amounts. Hence, we have market rates and different skills are priced differently. But for some kind of foundational work, time banks can be very helpful and very successful. And so, for instance, the time bank in Ithaca in upstate New York, known as the Ithaca Hour System, is still around today and functioning, and is actually very valued by that community. So while time banks aren't kind of the whole solution to currencies for sure, they may play an important into monetary system. There's also the idea of scrip, which is the term used for locally issued currencies, whether it's issued by individuals or companies or cities or what have you, over the centuries. And so what I'm showing here is an example of a scrip issued by a man named Joshua Norton, who lived in San Francisco in the 1800s. He was a very successful entrepreneur. Eventually, he lost everything, went a little bit crazy, and declared himself Emperor of the United States. And then issued his own currency. And Emperor Norton was so well liked among the people in San Francisco that they actually accepted his currency. And it circulated and could be used at local bars and restaurants and so on. But it just goes to show that all it takes for a currency to be able to work is agreement among some community that the currency actually holds value or could be used as a medium of exchange. Now, it's possible Emperor Norton sort of foreshadowed some of the arrogance we foresee in Silicon Valley today. So obviously we need to be careful with issuing currencies, but there's a lot more to this story. So another few great examples are after financial crises. So after the Great Depression and after the Great Recession, 10 years ago or so, there's been a proliferation of scrip issued by companies or small cities. And so two particular examples that emerged after the Great Depression I'm going to talk about briefly here. So one is what was called the Wurgel experiment. So Wurgel is a small town in Austria that in the early 30s issued their own currency to help combat the Depression. And the currency was so successful that it became known as the miracle of Wurgel because the city had an amazing recovery. Their employment recovered, economic activity recovered, and so on, in stark contrast to all the other cities in the nation and cities around the world. But unfortunately, the central bank saw this as such a threat, the Central Bank of Austria, that they shut it down, right? And this happened to be the fate of many of the local currencies, unfortunately, that were issued after the Great Depression. The central bank saw it as a threat, shut it down, and so we haven't been able to see how those experiments played out, which is somewhat telling that the central bank sees these things as threat, but hopefully opens up an opportunity for today where the new digital currencies are much more difficult to shut down. They're not based on paper, they're based on digital networks, and hopefully we can find and experiment with alternative relationships between local currencies and central bank issued currencies that provide, again, a more robust foundation for economic societies. Another great example here is the Wehrbank, which emerged in Switzerland, again, in the early 30s. And this was really a mutual credit union between businesses. So the way this worked is businesses got together, they didn't have access to cash. So one business said, look, I'll give you access to some of my goods and services, and that will give me some credit within the system that I can then redeem against other businesses within the system. So it sort of created like a mutual credit circle, right? And the Wehrbank was very successful and is still around today, 80, 90 years later. And it's got thousands of members and processed billions of dollars in value. And it functions actually complementary to the Swiss franc. And so maybe that's a model that other folks could look at adopting to help us build some more robustness into our society. Other examples are community currencies. So this was the Toronto dollar, which existed in Toronto for a bit. It's since shut down due to the administrative overhead of managing physical cash again. So maybe we'll be able to revive something like this with digital networks, which are cheaper to administrate. But the idea with the Toronto dollar was that 10% of every Toronto dollar purchased actually went to support local charitable causes, right? And so by engaging in commerce using the Toronto dollar, you were more effectively supporting local charities. Then, of course, there's the cryptocurrencies, and there's been a proliferation of cryptocurrencies. And from the outside, it might look like they're all the same. Why are there so many of them? But from the inside, it's very different because each cryptocurrency represents a different community and a different set of values held by that community. So you have Bitcoin, which is this like anarcho-libertarian global money, and then you have Ethereum, which is an experiment in avant-garde computational theory, and then you have Dogecoin, which is sort of a testament to the ability of memes to bring people together. You have Monero and Zcash, whose fundamental values are privacy, but even with the two of them, they approach privacy in very different ways, with the Monero community being more conservative and Zcash being a little bit more experimental. And so essentially the idea here is that different currencies can actually come to represent different values within a community. And we can potentially do a much better job as a society with structuring our monetary system with more currencies so that those currencies can better represent the values and the kind of productive capacity of local communities and of local societies. Now, let's talk a little bit more about consensus. So again, we've gone through a bunch of examples of currencies, and over the millennia, we've had cowrie shells and gold, and more recently the Federal Reserve and the money printer, and now we're moving into digital networks, right? And so now consensus is becoming almost literal in the sense that we have to program consensus algorithms to run on the digital networks to keep things in sync, right? But I just want to point out that you may have heard about consensus algorithms in the context of blockchains and so on. The consensus algorithms aren't anything new, right? They're not They haven't emerged out of nowhere. They're not new to blockchains. They've actually been around for decades. And in fact, humans started using consensus algorithms in the 80s when we decided we wanted to use computers to fly airplanes, right? And in order to do that, you needed the computers to be very fault tolerant. So you had multiple computers and they all stayed in sync on the airplane so that if any one of them failed in any kind of arbitrary way, got hit by lightning, it executed, unexpectedly, the other computers would be able to make up for it. And so we call this kind of tolerance to arbitrary failure Byzantine fault tolerance, which is sort of the parlance that has emerged in computer science to refer to being able to tolerate arbitrary kinds of failures. Then we've also had consensus algorithms be used not just in airplanes for decades, but in all the major internet applications. So whether it's Google or Amazon, at the bottom of their technology stack, there's a consensus algorithm that's used to keep their computers in sync. So they have computers all over the world. They need to keep them in sync to provide fault tolerance to whatever service they're providing. And in this domain, we talk about it as state machine replication. State machine just means an application, just a fancy word for it. Replication, the idea that it's replicated across many computers all over the world, and we need to keep them in sync. So consensus algorithms go way back. They're old news. But what's interesting about blockchains, or what blockchains kind of innovated on, was it sort of combined these things together. So it took the Byzantine fault tolerance that we've been using on airplanes, the state machine replication that we've been using for internet applications, and put them together to provide Byzantine fault tolerant applications specifically for things like currency. But now, when you're talking about currency, especially decentralized currency, you have to answer some difficult questions, right? So as we've seen, all the currency we've been talking about, they all have a mechanism that determines how they're issued. So, it's either the central bank or some local nonprofit or whatever that determines how the currency is issued into the public and how conflicting transactions are resolved, right? So this is going back to the double spend problem. There needs to be something that prevents me from sending the same currency to my local baker as to, a local charity or something, right? Because otherwise I could just keep spending the same currency and that'd be bad. The currency wouldn't be safe. And so there needs to be some kind of entity that regulates this, that prevents these double spends from happening. And so ultimately we need to figure out in a decentralized setting, who gets to decide on this? Because there's no single entity, right? And so this was the real challenge that Bitcoin solved initially and that many others have copied since. And the essential idea that Bitcoin introduced was that you could use economics to solve these problems. By introducing economics into the consensus network, you could actually solve all of these problems at once. And so whereas the previous consensus algorithms didn't require any kind of external economics and the algorithms were run entirely within a single entity, in the world of currencies, you have a diverse multi-stakeholder environment. So many different people are involved in actually hosting the thing, and you need to coordinate across all of them. And economics allows us to do that. And there's two particular ways that have emerged for solving this problem. And so the first, which was introduced by Bitcoin, is the idea of proof of work. And proof of work has sort of, there's been a lot of issues with it, and it's matured over the years and evolved into another approach, which is called proof of stake. And so I'll sort of compare and contrast them quickly here. So you may have heard about miners and mining in proof of work, the so-called Bitcoin miners who are wasting crazy amounts of electricity to mine Bitcoin. And so the idea with proof of work is essentially the answer to those three previous questions of who the currency gets issued to and who gets to decide is the people with the computational power. So anyone can show up with computational power, they can lend their computational power to the network, and that nets them some amount of control in the network, and it also earns them some rewards for contributing the computational power. So new Bitcoins get issued, and they get issued to the people contributing the computational power. And the graphs here, these are just very, very rough schematics. I don't mean to imply that things are actually linear. We're just sort of comparing that there's a relationship between the control in the network and the computational power you provide. Now contrast that with proof of stake. In the proof of stake world, instead of providing computational power and your control and your rewards being dependent on how much computational power you provide, it's instead dependent on how many coins you put at stake. So instead of buying external hardware and burning a bunch of electricity, you have to have coins within the system, actual stake within the system, and you have to put those coins at stake to then exercise control in the network and to participate, to be issued new units of the currency, and to be involved in the decision-making over which transactions get added and how the blockchain evolves over time. And what's really powerful about proof of stake and about having coins actually at stake is that you can punish people who misbehave. So a lot of the proof of stake algorithms today, if a validator, that's what we call proof of stake miners, we call them validators. If a validator misbehaves in some way, the coins that they put at stake can actually be destroyed. So they can be revoked. And therefore the validators can be punished. And this is a lot like the concept we're familiar with of security deposits among renter agreements, right? So you go to rent an apartment, you got a landlord, you put up a security deposit. If you put a hole in the wall, you lose your security deposit. But proof of stake is basically generalizing this notion of security deposits to the world of financial infrastructure and critical services at large, so that anyone who's providing critical services to the world has to put something at stake, so that if they misbehave or if they do things incorrectly, they lose some of that stake. So they have real skin in the game. And this is very powerful in the blockchain setting, but it could also be powerful more generally at large. Imagine, politicians had to put up some security deposit that they'd keep their promises or something like that. So it's sort of changing the paradigm to hopefully realign the incentives of our financial systems and of our larger socioeconomic structures. So just briefly going through some of the differences, pretty much every new blockchain that's launching is using proof of stake. A lot of existing blockchains, for instance, Ethereum is looking at moving to proof of stake and has been for some time. Essentially, again, the difference, proof of work is secured by computational power. Proof of stake is secured by having coins literally at stake. It's much faster. It has higher throughput. It's much, much, much more energy efficient. So, while it might make sense for there to be one proof of work blockchain like Bitcoin, maybe Bitcoin's not going away. If we're going to have many thousands of blockchains in the world, and if every, city is going to issue their own currency and so on, it's not going to make any sense to use proof of work blockchains for all of them or to use a single blockchain for all of them. We're going to need proof of stake style blockchains in order to support these many different blockchain applications. The other really nice thing about proof of work, about proof of stake, is that the validators are much more identifiable, right? So in proof of work, the miners are kind of anonymous. Anyone can just plug a mining rig into a wall. So here we have an image of an actual mining hardware. You buy one of these things, you plug it into your wall, now you're mining Bitcoin, right? There's nothing to it. In proof of stake, it actually requires a lot more competence. You have to be able to set up a server and operate it and keep it online for a long time. And you have to secure your coins that are at stake with a little chip like this here that you plug in, but it takes a lot more competence, and the people that are running the proof of stake, the validators, are a lot more identifiable, and they can be held accountable, which is very powerful, and is why proof of stake is really taking off, and so many of the new blockchains are looking at adopting it as the future of essentially decentralized internet hosting. Okay, so from there I want to go into talking a little bit about Cosmos. And so Cosmos is one of the leading proof of stake platforms, but Cosmos is much more than just a single blockchain or a set of blockchains. It's a project that's trying to build out the internet of blockchains, right? And so in the same way that the internet many years ago interconnected the many different computers and computing networks all around the world, Cosmos is looking to interconnect the many different blockchains. So if we're going to have we already have hundreds, and one day we may have many, many thousands of different blockchains. If they can't talk to each other, if they can't connect to each other, we're going to have a problem. It's going to be very clumsy to go from one to another, or for people to move their money around more freely, or to run applications and so on. And so the goal of Cosmos is to really interconnect all those different blockchains. And fundamentally, Cosmos is really a philosophy of blockchain design. And there's many different components. So, if you're interested more in Cosmos, we could go into it a lot more detail another time. But the philosophy of Cosmos really breaks down into three sections: sovereignty, heterogeneity, and interoperability. And what I mean by that is, so sovereignty. We want people that are putting up their own blockchains and building their own blockchains to have as much control over them as possible. So unlike building on Bitcoin or building on Ethereum, where you're sort of beholden to that platform, Cosmos is more of a philosophy and a framework than it is a particular blockchain, and it gives you as much freedom and flexibility to design the thing as you need to fit your values and your community. Heterogeneity is sort of related to that. It means that there can be many different kinds of blockchains, and they can all do something different, and they can use different programming language, different kinds of cryptography, different kinds of economic mechanisms, and so on. So it's really about the flexibility there. And then interoperability, we need all of these sovereign heterogeneous blockchains to be able to connect and to interoperate with one another. And so Cosmos today, there's many different blockchains that are built using the Cosmos technology stack. One of them is known as the Cosmos Hub. It's been running in production for over a year now. It supports, close to $1 billion worth of value. It fluctuates based on the price. There's a number of others that are running in production, but I'd also point out Binance, who's one of the largest, if not the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world. When they chose to build their decentralized exchange platform and to run their own blockchain for it, they chose the Cosmos technology. Not because of Cosmos's superior business development effort, but simply because of those three values of sovereignty and heterogeneity and interoperability provided them as much freedom and flexibility as they needed to actually build out something that best served them. So Cosmos is also a framework. It comes with many different components that you can just compose together to get exactly the application that you need. And so, for instance, it's got modules for staking, for proof of stake, and for collecting rewards and fees. It's got modules for governance so that the stakeholders can actually govern the blockchain. Sorry, I think, okay, that's okay. and many other modules provided by the community and so on. So you can just compose together the modules that you need to build whatever blockchain fits for you. And of course, you can build your own modules and so on. And then, of course, the goal here is to connect all these different blockchains together using our interoperability protocol. We call that IBC, Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, to connect blockchains built using the Cosmos framework, but also existing blockchains, maybe not using the Cosmos framework. And so there isn't any singular requirement for you to be part of this kind of larger Cosmos effort. And this interoperability protocol is not specific to Cosmos. It's much more general in order to connect the many different blockchains of the world. And if it helps, you can sort of think of it like the SWIFT interbank protocol. So there's many different banks all over the world, and they need to be able to send money and communicate with one another. They use a standardized messaging protocol called SWIFT. If you ever wired money, you probably know about SWIFT bank codes and so on. And so IBC is very similar to that, to allow these different blockchains to send messages and to communicate with one another. Okay, so to wrap up, I'm just going to go into a few examples of blockchain applications being built using the Cosmos technology stack. So we were talking earlier about stablecoins. So there's a few different examples of stablecoins being built using the Cosmos technology. So one, for instance, is e-money. E-money is a custodial stablecoin. Custodial meaning there's actual real fiat money in the bank with a regulated custodian. And then the e-money is a digital representation of that money, functions as a stablecoin. They have it for both euro and the Swiss franc, and then you can use that stablecoin, on a digital platform and use it for different kinds of things. Very similar to the kinds of central bank currencies we were talking about earlier. Just instead of a central bank backing it, it's another regulated financial institution. Another approach that's used by Terra, which is somewhat more interesting, is to have actually a decentralized stablecoin, where instead of having fiat money in a bank with a regulated custodian, you have the stablecoin being backed by another cryptocurrency. So some other cryptocurrency is locked up on the blockchain, and that's used as collateral to stabilize the stablecoin so that it can hold its value. Now, that might sound like magic, and in some sense it is. The mechanism for that is very interesting and is something, unfortunately, we can't go into too much detail here, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, let us know. We could talk about it briefly in the Q&A, or we could potentially do another one of these sessions focusing more specifically on those kinds of mechanisms and how they can be used. So another really interesting application, this one a little bit less financial and more targeting kind of the sustainability issues, is called the Regen Network. So this is another blockchain application being built with Cosmos, and the goal for the Regen Network is to realign the economics of agriculture and of environmental stewardship. So whereas right now the current financial system has kind of left the environment in the mud in some sense, no pun intended, and there's huge degradation in water quality and soil quality and air quality and so on. The goal for the Regen Network is by using the coordination capacities of a blockchain to coordinate different people and to get consensus on things, to actually directly incentivize being better stewards of the environment by monitoring ecological state, so monitoring water quality and monitoring changes, so seeing that improvements were actually made, and then directly rewarding the people who partook in actually making those changes. And the reason this is so powerful is because it could save countries and counties and cities huge amounts of money that they currently have to spend in cleanup costs, simply because they're not able to coordinate farmers and land stewards up front to more responsibly dispose of pollutants. They end up having to pay massive amounts in cleaning up the water, cleaning up the soil, and so on. Whereas if they could use a system like this, they could directly incentivize those people up front and monitor that and save a huge amount of money down the road by keeping things in better and more tip-top shape. So the Regen Network is hoping to launch later this year, and is one of the really interesting applications of this kind of coordination technology to actually cleaning up the environment and using, in some sense, finance for good to incentivize responsible and sustainable stewardship. Another really nice example being built using the Cosmos technology stack is the Althea network. So Althea is building something called a mesh net, or really a framework for deploying mesh nets. So what are mesh nets? A mesh net is the idea of having peer-to-peer internet connectivity. So rather than everyone having to subscribe to Rogers or Bell or TechSavvy or whatever to get their internet from, they can actually share internet between themselves. So obviously, a couple of people will have to subscribe to the larger internet to get access, to the major internet backbone. But then once they have that, they can share the internet with the rest of the community so that everyone doesn't need to establish an independent connection to the internet backbone. And this is very powerful, especially in rural communities where they're chronically underserved by the incumbent internet service providers because it's too expensive and there's not enough, incentive to roll out internet infrastructure out there. These mesh nets can actually enable the entire community to share in a much smaller number of internet connections and still do so efficiently and effectively. And so the way Althea works is it allows these routers to be set up, so people will deploy routers in their community. They're not too hard to set up. Really, anyone can do it, and enables the community to share their internet connection and to pay one another directly in a peer-to-peer fashion using cryptocurrency for access to the internet. And so they've seen a huge uptick in demand over the last month or two as a result of so many more people working from home and in need of critical internet access, where that access isn't being provided by the incumbent ISPs, and Althea is actually enabling people to actually connect to the internet today in places where they otherwise wouldn't have. And all of this is made possible through the kind of innovations of cryptocurrency coordination technology. And ultimately, the goal for Althea is to be deployed much more widely across the world. They're currently in a number of communities across North America, but that will ultimately enable them to interconnect with other blockchains and to provide many more services and critical functionalities. So finally, and this is the last slide here, the kind of overall goal and vision for Cosmos is to, this internet of blockchains, but to enable an emerging network of community currencies, of currencies that represent alternative kinds of value beyond just kind of the central bank debt and what we're used to in the financial system, to directly incentivize more valuable behaviors and things that communities care much more about to build a more robust, more sustainable society. And the technology we have today is mature enough that you can already start doing this, and we're already seeing some real world applications of it, the Regen Network, Althea, and others. And we hope to see many more people adopting this and using this as sort of a new foundation for sustainability within the financial system. And with that, thank you so much for your attention.
All right, awesome. So Ariane.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them. Oh, we have a couple questions here. So I'm going to just start reading them off, and then they will be fielded accordingly. So first question that came up was, how does the digital currency impact money laundering and drug trafficking? So does someone want to field that?
Yeah, I'll take that. As I touched on a little bit earlier. Yeah, great question. So the way that essentially that there's a lot more control over the system, such that when you have a central bank digital currency, the way that they would do this is that the central bank essentially has a ledger or a record of every account in the system and sees the money going in and out. So if you know, for example, that an account would belong to a bad actor, you can immediately ban them from the system or prevent any inflows from other sources. Or if you look at it from a larger scale, you always have a clean record of where money went through. So instead of trying to do complicated money laundering features where it'll go through multiple projects before being able to be clean money in the end, it actually means that any system would be able to see a direct linkage all the way to the end and this bad actor without actually them ever being able to hide their identities. So it means that it gives another degree of control over the system. It by no means doesn't mean it's foolproof, but it does mean that overall you have a situation where there's more control for the government to identify actors that could be problematic. Now, obviously that touches on, who gets identified, who's a bad actor. But at the end of the day, it means that if you have a situation of international funding to something like Al-Qaeda, which has been a problem in the past, that's the sort of thing that you're able to more directly cut out from the start. If anyone else wants to add to that.
There's a follow-up. Sorry, if anyone wants to follow up before we move on to the next question. Go ahead.
I mean, I guess I can just point in that even with Bitcoin, the network being pseudonymous, where you actually don't know the identities of the individuals, but all the transactions are completely transparent to everyone. There's a lot of forensics that's being done on the, kind of analyzing the patterns and trends of transfers of the Bitcoin because it's open to everyone. So a lot of these companies can actually start finding these, call it fraudulent or terrorism related activities that are kind of patterns going to the similar accounts. So there's a lot of forensics that can be done just by having more uniform data or better access to the information. Whereas right now with cash, I could give someone cash and no one ever, anyone will know that transaction ever occurred. Whereas, of course, there's a lot of permissions and privacy that needs to be considered, but the availability of that data lets us govern it better.
Awesome. So why don't we move on to a next question? So second question, could central banks use Cosmos to let citizens exchange digital CAD? For example, for a different type of coin like Althea, would they need to use something like Cosmos? So maybe
there's a lot of ways that exchanges for digital coins can be built. One of the originating motivations for Cosmos was to enable more secure digital exchanges, or decentralized exchanges. So, we've seen a lot of issues with cryptocurrency exchanges to date. A lot of them have gone under, and hundreds of millions of dollars have gone missing. For instance, we had the somewhat catastrophic blow up of Quadriga in Canada the other year. So one of the goals of Cosmos was to enable decentralized exchanges that didn't take custody, that didn't allow an individual company or individual to take custody over your funds, but still allowed you to exchange funds, exchange your coin for others. And another thing that I should just point out that we didn't really get to talk about in the presentation, because maybe it's too much detail, is that there's new crypto economic primitives that are emerging to facilitate exchanges between different kinds of cryptocurrencies that are more than just having a floating exchange rate or a fixed peg. So when we talk about stablecoin, it's got a fixed rate, 1-to-1 with the dollar or whatever. And if it's not a stablecoin, then it's typically floating freely on an exchange, and the price is super volatile and it just fluctuates. But certain economic primitives have emerged in the cryptocurrency world that allow you to actually play out a spectrum between those two extremes, and to have sort of mixes of them and somewhat more controlled exchange rates that are neither fixed nor fully free floating. And so it's possible that some of the new local currencies or whatever that might emerge might have a more direct relationship with the dollar that's somewhere on that spectrum, that doesn't necessarily require the same kind of like free floating exchange rate exchanges, but would allow more automated exchange on a sort of algorithmic basis. So, there's a lot of mechanism involved there that'd be really interesting to go into, that, maybe we'll do another webinar on in the future.
Cool. So next question from Miguel. You mentioned inclusion as a key consideration. What has been the key stumbling block of end user organizations, retail companies, for example, trusting the system? My guess would be it means increased IT spend to ensure the safety of the system. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I guess I can jump in. Overall, there's been a lot of projects that are trying to kind of tackle the end usability of these systems and what it really means. So cryptocurrencies is really the first use case that has kind of exploded, and a lot of things are being experimented with. But really what we're seeing from a data and cybersecurity perspective, doing business across multiple external parties today is really expensive. And data gets siloed. There's a lot of risks in mismanagement of data. And ultimately, the cybersecurity costs for large institutions today are very high. So by creating a system where, rather than trusting the counterparty that you're doing business with, whether it be a merchant or business to business, you actually trust that the network itself is holding up that security or that guarantee of transfer of money. So what we're actually seeing is a lot of projects that are adopting blockchain technology are actually reducing their IT costs and their cybersecurity costs. And one thing I'll kind of just relay is we see the costs of large cybersecurity hacks, right? These data breaches and data hacks, it costs billions of dollars of going backwards and trying to repair. And even if you use dollars or money to fix that problem, it's people's privacy, it's people's data that has been leaked. And so these technologies promise to keep the information more secure, and so that hacks and breaches like this can be completely eradicated in the future.
Awesome. So just jumping down to a few other questions. I'm going to move around here. Question from Charlie. The reason creating currencies is mainly left to the government is that retail investors are in danger of being defrauded. How can we allow community currencies to be created while limiting the risk to retail investors?
This is a great question, but it supposes that retail investors aren't already being defrauded by the government in their management of the currency, which is, I think, blatant at this point, especially given what we're seeing in the U.S. For instance. Obviously, Canada manages things a little bit better, but these massive bailouts of companies who spend all their money and time, pumping up their stock and buying back their stock, and are now being bailed out to the tune of many, many billions of dollars, when the average person is, we've seen 3 million layoffs in the U.S. and $1,000 a month or something in relief. So I think the reality is that people are being defrauded at a massive scale. And the reason they're being defrauded is because there's so little accountability in the government. The government operates so far away from the individual and from a community member. And part of that was for, the necessity of operating with economies of scale in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, the dynamics of information flow are very different. And so the idea here isn't so much to, let anyone declare themselves emperor of the United States and issue their own currency like our friend Emperor Norton, but to bring currency issuance under the control of more local institutions, right? So municipalities more so than, just like random corporations. And municipalities are really at the front line of response for anything, and are really the front line of globalization and so on. More than half the world's population lives in cities. And the fact that cities all over the world don't really have any sovereign rights and are, not recognized by constitutions and are just corporations owned by the province or what have you. It's kind of a mockery of the situation we're in, and the actual reality of the world. So I think that needs to be readjusted. And more than anything, kind of what I'm sort of getting at is that there should be some form of monetary policy operating at the level of the municipality. And definitely retail investors are always, investors or users, whatever you want to call them, are always going to be at great risk of being defrauded. And so we need responsible institutions that can be held accountable. And our federal governments have shown that, to a significant extent, they're not really capable of that. And municipal governments are maybe going to be better able to do so. But it's definitely an important question, and one that needs a lot more research and experimentation to actually figure out what the right way is to design these more local currencies, and to make them actually complementary to the national currency and to support the national currency rather than to compete with it or to challenge it like the central banks felt in the 30s.
Awesome. Thanks, Ethan. Moving on to a question from Cyrus. Do you all think digital currency like this could replace fiat currency before internet or computing devices become a human right? How could we address the portion of the population that still depends on physical money?
This is a really challenging question.
That's a great one coming from Cyrus. Yeah, so that's a point I touched on quite heavily with the inclusion, especially because you do have a lot of people the world over that rely on physical currency in order to go about their daily lives. So before any of this can be considered at a wide scale, we do have to look at how does anyone access the system now. And so across a lot of Asia, for example, there's much, much higher mobile penetration than much of North America. So one option is integrating it with your mobile application. So we do have to have a base level of technology to let people get involved. But even in areas around the world where there may be less prosperity, there are applications such as if you look at like the M-Pesa in, I believe, Kenya, someone can correct me, but essentially there are applications whereby you can send money purely from mobile to mobile with a quick login. So even with having an old style flip phone, it is possible to have inclusion in this sort of society. Now, does it mean we're going to switch over really quickly? I don't think so. I do think it'll be an iterative process bit by bit. But additionally, the part of the question saying, could this replace fiat currency? I don't think that necessarily these are going to simply replace it. I do think there will always be some sort of role of fiat currency in this ecosystem. The question is really how well do they integrate with those sort of decentralized currencies that we see now? And that will pretty much weigh up depending on how willing to play ball the governments around the world are, and just how much push there is in terms of demand for these cryptocurrencies. So I think a lot of it depends on systems like Cosmos that are enabling people to be able to join this new system and to be able to start building on these decentralized applications. So kind of a long-winded way of saying it depends. But I do think that keeping inclusion of those populations that may be less able to join is something that has to be paramount as this grows. Otherwise, you're going to leave out a huge percentage of people that could really benefit from this.
Great. So another question here from Robert. There are many platforms out there, and with Bermuda still in the planning process for their central bank digital currency and shopping around, what platforms do you think are the right fit?
Cosmos.
So I'll jump in there. As you know, we've done some research on this, and of course Cosmos is a great option to consider. But really, from our understanding of what the Bermuda strategy is going to look like, it'll be more of a payments infrastructure with a lot of layers built underneath that looks to just be open to all of these different systems. So rather than Bermuda building their own blockchain and minting like a Bermuda dollar, they want to create a framework, a digital framework where all of these different currencies can be accepted. And with a layer of conversion kind of sitting underneath, you can be paying in Bitcoin and someone can be receiving in Ethereum. Then you can take that Ethereum and spend it at another store, and then that person will accept it in Cosmos. And ultimately, the goal is to create this open framework. And I think there's a very interesting way of going about it, because we are seeing all these digital currencies kind of pop up around the world, and there's going to be a lot of experimentation. So we see Hyperledger being used just because, IBM backed it, so people trust that and things like that. But I think it's really clever how Bermuda, as a small country that, historically has their currency pegged to the US dollar, to allow themselves to be in an opportunity to, see what's happening, how things are evolving, and ultimately create this framework that can accept the new currencies of the world and not allow themselves to kind of get cut out of this evolving digital financial ecosystem. So Cosmos, I'd love to talk to Dennis Pitcher a little bit more about Cosmos, but we'll save that for another one.
Cool. Thanks, Graham. I'm going to move to the chat. Richard had a question, just more of a meta question. So do you see a world of multiple digital currencies with less or no physical money whatsoever?
Probably. I mean, it's unclear if physical money will go away completely. Probably not. We are physical beings, and we require, physical goods to stay alive. And so long as that's the case, there will be probably some role for physical medium of exchange. But given all the issues with physical currencies and with administrating them, and as more and more people come online, and the hardware increasingly commodifies and becomes available to essentially the whole world, it's possible that we do go completely online. I think there's some risk of mandating it and making physical medium of exchange illegal. I think that would be bad for sure. There's a lot of privacy concerns that still need to be addressed, and a lot of governments are probably going to do a really bad job and a really dangerous job with moving currencies online, and so we need to be pretty vigilant about that. But it does seem increasingly that most of the world's commerce is already probably digital, and that trend is probably only going to continue.
And I would say, even just to add to Ethan's point of kind of distinguishing, agreed with pretty much everything he said there. Saying that fiat does not necessarily mean that it's physical coins and notes. Fiat simply meaning that it is that created by a central government and based on trust rather than being backed by something. So I would say, as Ethan said, there will probably exist some sort of physical medium regardless. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the role of fiat and the role of government is going to decrease heavily in currencies.
Great. So we have about 2 minutes, so time for one last question. Why don't we do one here from an anonymous attendee? Any general thoughts on how Canada's central bank should be thinking about CBDC? Are there important initiatives Canada's central bank should be doing that they're not yet or not doing quickly enough of?
Well, Canada, actually, I'm just reading on this morning. Canada actually did start looking into doing a CBDC program. They've been, I think, kicked off around about last March, give or take, so about a year ago. And actually, they came to the conclusion that at this time, they weren't going to forge ahead with it. So that was around about October or so. So there's been a couple papers come out. Canada's keeping an eye on it. They simply haven't moved ahead at this time. But I do think part of that, and they have noted, is kind of the lack of a global infrastructure to allow for that has been a bit of a roadblock in that sense. So until there's some sort of underlying infrastructure that allows for much more easy transfer of money, it will potentially be a bit of a back burner for Canada. But fingers crossed for them too. I live here now, so I'm biased between Canada and Bermuda, but both countries seem to be looking at it the right way.
And I would strongly encourage them to consider the idea of municipal currencies somewhat tied to the Canadian dollar, so that they're grounded in the Canadian dollar and complement and support the Canadian dollar, but have some degree of monetary policy freedom at the local level, and provide a better way to compound value locally, to stave off some of the exploitation that we see with foreign companies coming in, extracting value out of cities and so on. I think that could really distinguish Canada, and would be a great opportunity for the rest of the world also to learn about.
Awesome. So with that, I think the questions, we'll wrap up the questions. Anything else that we're happy to share the presentation? Karam, I'll leave you to make a final closing remark.
Yeah, just again, thank you everyone. We appreciate everyone, donating to the cause, and we really hope to continue this. So we are looking to do one in a month or so on another topic, and we'll engage with you guys to hear about what you found interesting in this presentation, what we could build on, and please do feel free to contact us, send us your questions, and let's keep the communication going, because we are in a digital world and we can stay connected through presentations and discussions like this. And again, I just really want to thank everybody for participating, and I really hope that you guys learned a few things, and more than anything, I hope it provokes some thought, and take that thought, create some questions, and come bug us.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, guys.